So how many of you have said to your children or maybe your grandchildren, or in all honesty, how many of us remember someone saying this to us? Why isn't your room picked up and cleaned with more than just that single path to your bed? You recognize that, don't you? I know. You've been up here for over an hour. What on earth have you been doing? Am I the only one who's heard that before or said it? To the response, generally, at least the one that I gave many years ago, was nothing. Cleaning? No. Getting ready to clean. With the parent looking closer, seeing an electronic device under the child's pillow or somewhere else. Busted. The disciples in Mark's story this morning most definitely busted. Last week, Peter went from star student with his response of "You are the Messiah" to receiving a detention slip as Jesus rebukes Peter for his rebuke. Smooth move, Peter, smooth. And in today's episode from Mark doesn't get a whole lot better. The disciples and Jesus have made their way from Caesarea Philippi to Capernaum, getting closer and closer on the way to Jerusalem, where Jesus would undergo great suffering. For honest suffering, clearly that his disciples did not understand. And if we'll be really honest and vulnerable with ourselves, suffering that we don't understand either. In verse 31, Jesus again predicts his death. But once at Capernaum, Jesus wants to know what the disciples have been arguing about on the way. Oops. Nothing. Getting ready for suffering? The disciples were smart enough in this instance to be silent. They weren't silent out of a sense of humility, though. They were silent because their argument was ridiculous. Really. Jesus' disciples twice heard him predict his suffering and heard him predict his death. And what were they arguing over? Who's the greatest? Really? Not how to feed the poor, not how they might be present with Jesus when his time of suffering came, not about who would look after Mother Mary after his death. Jesus' disciples argue over who's the greatest. Now, to be fair, the disciples were full of fear, and they lacked understanding. Mark's gospel gets that completely evident, makes that completely clear to all of us. Yes, they loved Jesus, and they even got on well, especially with Christ's revolutionary love, but all Jesus' talk of suffering just didn't line up for them. Perhaps Jesus' disciples had higher hopes than witnessing their leader die a cruel, cruel death. Rather than grasping Jesus' message, the disciples have an argument over who the greatest might be. In their fear, the disciples went from focusing on God's message of unconditional love to concern over themselves, concern over who is the greatest. And I think that it's easy, at least it is for me, it's easy to smile and sit back and think, I wouldn't do that today. Really? I wouldn't? Do we? It's part of our humanity to be competitive. Some of us are way more competitive than others. And for some, competition brings out the best. Great. For others, and hopefully we know ourselves this way if this is our case, for some of us, competition turns us into monsters. And hopefully we have enough reflection to acknowledge that. Regardless, the disciples fell short of recognizing their life of service with Jesus. So he reminds them yet again, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. And then he took a little child and put it among them. And taking it in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes me welcomes one such child in my name, welcomes me. Whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. When times get challenging and uneasy for us today, it's all too easy to focus on self rather than looking to how we can serve one another. I want to share a story called The Rabbi's Gift. It's an untold story by Francis Dorff. It's not my own, but it has a great message. The story runs along the lines of there was, at one point, a really famous monastery which had fallen on hard times. It used to have hundreds and hundreds of brothers. The building was overflowing, the cloister was overflowing, and The buildings were filled with young monks, and its big church resounded with the finest singing of chant that you could ever imagine. But now this cloister was deserted. People no longer came there to be nourished by the monks in their prayer life. A handful of older monks shuffled through the cloisters, and they praised their God with heavy hearts on a daily basis. On the edge of the monastery woods, there was an old rabbi who'd built a little hut. He would come there from time to fast and to pray. No one ever spoke with him, but whenever he appeared and he shared a word would be passed from monk to monk that the rabbi walks in the woods. And for as long as he was there, the monks would feel sort of sustained by this rabbi's prayerful presence. One day, the abbot was just so down and out and dejected by the hard times that they had fallen upon. They had to wear face masks. No, that's another story. They didn't have to wear face masks. But the abbot was just so down and out that he decided he would go and he would talk with the rabbi and open his heart up. So after the morning Eucharist, he set out through the woods. As he approached the hut, the abbot saw the rabbi standing in the doorway, his arms outstretched in welcome. It was as though he'd been waiting there for some time, and the two embraced like long-lost brothers. Then they stepped back, and they just stood there, smiling at one another with smiles their faces could hardly contain. After a while, the rabbi motioned for the abbot to enter. In the middle of the room, there was a small wooden table right in the center with the Holy Scriptures opened up on it. And they sat there for a moment in the presence of the Word. And then the rabbi began to cry. And the abbot couldn't contain himself either. And he covered his face with his hands and began to cry along with him. For the first time in the abbot's life, he cried his heart out. And the two men sat there like lost children, filling the hut with their sobs, wetting the Word with their tears. After the tears ceased to flow and all was quiet once again, the rabbi lifted his head up. He acknowledged the abbot and said, "You and your brothers are serving God with really heavy hearts. And I know you've come to ask a teaching of me, and I'll give you a teaching, but you can only repeat this teaching once. After that, no one must ever say it aloud again." The rabbi looked straight at the abbot, who was eager to hear the abbot's word, or the rabbi's word, his teaching. And the rabbi shared with him, "The Messiah is among you." For a while, all was silent. And then the rabbi said, "That's it. You can go home now." The abbot left without a word and without ever looking back. Well, the next morning, the abbot called his monks together there in the chapter room, and he told them he had received a teaching from the rabbi who walks in the woods, and that this teaching was never again to be spoken aloud. So the rest of the brothers were excited. He'd had a conversation with the rabbi, but they were confused. They can't speak the word aloud again. What's this? And the abbot looked at each of the brothers and said, "The rabbi said that one of us is the Messiah." Oh, it's a lot. The monks were startled by this saying. What could it mean? They asked themselves to one another, is it Brother John the Messiah? He sets up the altar on a regular basis. We know that if someone's out of town, that Brother John's going to take care of the altar area. I don't know. What about Father Matthew? It could be Father Matthew. He is always on time to sing in the chancel choir. It may very well be Father Matthew. What about Brother Thomas? You know that if we don't have a fellowship hour, you can always count on Brother Thomas to slide out. Oh, that's another story too. Am I the Messiah? What could that mean if I'm the Messiah? So they were all deeply puzzled by the rabbi's teaching. They kept scratching their heads, and they kept praying, and they kept talking over one another. No one ever mentioned it again. But as time went by the rest of that week and onward, the monks began to treat one another with a really sweet and special reverence. There was a gentle, wholehearted human quality about them now, which was hard to describe, but really quite perceptible and easy to notice. They lived with one another as men, as children of God who had finally found something. But they prayed the Scriptures together as men who were always looking for something. Occasional visitors found themselves deeply moved by the life of these monks. And before long, people started coming from far and from wide to be nourished by the prayer life of the monks again. And young men were starting to ask once again to live with the monks for a lifetime. In those days, the rabbi no longer walked in the woods. His hut had fallen into ruins. But somehow or other, the old monks who had taken his teaching to heart still felt sustained by his prayerful presence. They knew the Messiah. They experienced the Messiah. They looked for the Messiah in each other. One of us is the Messiah. I found this story early last week. Oftentimes it comes to me, the illustration comes at the last moment. I'm very happy that I found it early in the week because I had all sorts of wonderful events happen last week. And there's always in anyone's week some challenging appointments or tasks to do. And I remembered this story all week long. And can I tell you, the difference it made is I met with people from all walks of life, not even associated with this place or these people. But I was around all sorts of folks. And I thought, you might be the Messiah. That's good news. You might be the Messiah. I'm sitting here talking with Jesus right now. I'm not sure where Jesus is because the words you're saying are kind of hard to hear and you're not very nice. But you might be the Messiah. And let me tell you how radically some of my days turned around where I came home and my spouse would say, "How was your day?" I didn't utter it to her, but I said, "My day is great." And in my mind I was thinking, I saw the Messiah. I saw Jesus. It's kind of a presence that I had when I served as an intern back in West Virginia at St. John's. There was something really special, not just about that space. To be sure, it was a clear space, a thin space. But the people were also a thin people, if you will. And we were always on the look for the Messiah in one another and in the stranger who came in our midst, as well as the stranger when we were the stranger coming into another's midst. So my hope and my prayer, my invitation for us this morning is as we extend the peace with one another, as we receive Eucharist, as we have fellowship, remember that one of you is the Messiah. So we better keep our eyes open. We better look and listen and treat one another as Jesus treats us. Amen.